At the start of November for the last couple of years, I've broken away from the busyness of my normal schedule so that I could go to Rockport and simply spend some time in prayer and preparation for the next year. And so I stay in a condo there, and I turn the living room of that condo into a little office space for myself. And I get up early each day, and I simply spend the day working. But when evening comes, I like to break away from the condo and drive through Rockport. Now, for those of you that don't know this about me already, Rockport is where I spent a bulk of my childhood. It's where I graduated from high school. And so the drives that I take in the evening, they are not aimless drives. Rather, I drive through town with intention. There are streets that I want to drive down. There are places that I want to see. I drive by my old schools, my elementary, my intermediate, junior high, and high schools. I like to drive by the building that used to house the theater that I worked in when I was a senior in high school. I drive by the house that I grew up in. I like to drive out to the big tree out there. And while there are many things that have changed about Rockport over the years, some positive things, maybe some negative things because of the hurricane that they had, it's still good to remember. So last week we launched into a series titled Faithful, and let me just remind you that this is the same title of the series that we began this year with. And if you were here with us then you'll remember we started out this year by talking about our call to be faithful, that we would be a faithful people in all things at all times until it's all over. As we've moved into the Advent season, Advent meaning the coming, we're being reminded not of our call to be faithful, rather we're being reminded of how God has proven himself to be faithful through the sending of his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, if you're newer to church or if you're newer to the Christian faith, the Advent season is the time leading up to Christmas, leading up to the celebration of Christ coming into this world all those years ago. Now, as we think about the Christmas season, because of all of the busyness of the holidays, because of the commercialization of Christmas, I think it's very easy for us to go through the motions and simply travel aimlessly towards Christmas morning. But what I love about the Advent season is that Advent helps us to move through this season not aimlessly, but with intention. Let me say that again. Advent helps us to move through this season not aimlessly, but with intention, especially as we gather together on Sunday mornings. And so as we go through this series titled Faithful, my desire is not to move aimlessly through this series, but with intention. And so there are certain streets that I want to drive down with you. There are certain things that I want you to see and be reminded of once again, because it's good to remember. And so specifically, we're looking at and being reminded of the different gifts that God has been faithful to provide to us through the provision of his Son, Jesus Christ. But I want you to understand, when Jesus came into this world all those years ago, when he was born in that stable, when he was laid in that manger, Jesus' coming was not aimless. Rather, Jesus came into this world with intention. Jesus' coming was not aimless. Jesus came into this world with intention, and his intention was for the salvation of our souls. And so when we come to know Jesus as the Lord of our life, we receive that gift of salvation. But along with the gift of salvation, along with the gift of Jesus, we're also reminded of these other gifts that we receive. The gift of hope, the gift of peace, the gift of joy, the gift of love, the gifts that we talk about as we light these Advent candles each Sunday morning. And all of these gifts, God has been faithful to provide these gifts to us because he was faithful first to provide Jesus. And so if you were here last week, you'll remember we talked about the gift of hope. This morning, as we look at our passage, we're going to talk about the gift of peace. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to John chapter 14. We're going to look at verses 27 through 31 this morning. John chapter 14, verses 27 through 31. Now, as you're turning there, let me set this up for you. Leading up to our passage, Jesus has been with the disciples. He's shared in that Last Supper with the disciples. He has predicted the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. He has washed the disciples' feet. And now he's beginning to prepare them for his crucifixion. He's beginning to prepare them for his departure. Now you might ask, well, why are we talking about Christ's departure during the Advent season when Advent is really focused on the coming of Christ? And so I would remind you that the cross is the reason for the coming. Apart from the cross, apart from Jesus coming into this world to be the sacrifice of mankind, we would not have his coming into this world all those years ago. The cross is the reason for the coming. And so as Jesus prepares the disciples for his departure, what we see in the passage is Jesus talks about this gift of peace. So with that in mind, let's read our passage now. John chapter 14, verses 27 through 31. Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Don't let your heart be troubled or fearful. You have heard me tell you, I am going away and I'm coming to you. If you loved me, you would rejoice that I am going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. I have told you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you may believe. I will not talk with you much longer, because the ruler of the world is coming. He has no power over me. On the contrary, so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do as the Father commanded me. Get up, let's leave this place." So, as we look at this passage, I want to begin by looking at the first part of verse 27 with you. Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives." I want to begin by highlighting that word peace there, because we're talking about the gift of peace this morning. Now, the New Testament was written in Greek, and so the word that was translated there as peace was a Greek word. But what Jesus would have been saying for the Jews, Jesus would have been speaking in Hebrew. And the Hebrew word that Jesus would have been using was a very common expression, both as a greeting and as a farewell. It was a common expression to Jews at that time. It's still a common expression among Jews today, and you've probably heard this expression before. It's the word shalom. So for the Jews, it was typical to say shalom, or peace be with you, when someone was leaving. And I'm sure there was a deeper sense of meaning when they first started saying shalom to one another. When they first started saying peace be with you upon someone's departure, there was likely a deeper sense of meaning, but over time, like many things, it had probably lost some of its meaning. For example, in our culture, we're very used to saying goodbye when someone is leaving. We don't give that word much thought when we say goodbye. But that word goodbye, it actually comes from, it's an abbreviated phrase for God be with you. Originally, when people would leave, they would say, God be with you. And then over time, it was shortened to God be. So if someone's leaving, they'd say, God be. And then slowly over time, it morphed from God be to goodbye. But even as we began saying goodbye, towards the beginning of that time, I'm sure there was a greater sense of saying, God be with you, goodbye. But over time, it's lost much of its meaning. And now we simply say goodbye just as a casual thing. We don't give much thought to it. This is really how it had become for the Jews to say goodbye, or to say shalom, or peace be with you, when someone was departing. It had really just become a casual saying without much thought put into it. But when Jesus spoke these words to the disciples, "Peace I leave with you," Jesus did so with great meaning. In fact, Jesus goes on to say, "I don't give to you as the world gives." In other words, this is not just a normal goodbye. This is not just a normal peace that I'm leaving with you. I'm leaving with you a peace that is greater than what the world leaves with you. I'm leaving you my peace. understand the peace of Jesus is a greater peace. The peace that Jesus gives is a greater peace. You see, the peace that the world offers is really an external peace. It's a peace that we're able to experience when everything is going well around us, when everything is going our way. We might even say in those times that we feel a sense of calm. But when everything is going wrong, when everything seems like it's falling apart, we don't feel the sense of calm. We feel a sense of chaos. In other words, we are not at peace. But while the world offers us an external peace, Jesus offers us an internal peace, which is a peace that we are able to experience both in the midst of the calm and the chaos. It's a peace that we can experience when things are going our way, but also when it seems like everything is falling apart around us. It's a peace that we're able to experience not simply because things are going well around us, but because things are going well inside of us. While the world offers us an external peace, Jesus offers us an internal peace. It is a greater peace. And so Jesus tells the disciples, I'm giving you a greater peace, not like the world gives, but a peace that is greater than the world gives. It is my peace. And so I would just ask you this morning, do you have the peace of Jesus today? I'm not asking you if everything is going well around you. I'm not asking you if you feel this sense of calm because there is a calm in the things around you. I'm asking you if you have the peace of Jesus. And if you would say, I don't have that peace of Jesus, then my prayer would be that you wouldn't wait until Christmas morning to receive this gift, but that you would receive this gift of peace through Jesus Christ even today. It is a greater peace. And so as we think about this peace that God has been faithful to provide for us through Jesus Christ, this peace that is greater, there are a few things that I want us to consider about this peace this morning. First, Jesus gives a peace that is greater than our own hearts. Let's look at the second part of verse 27 again. It says, don't let your heart be troubled or fearful. Don't let your heart be troubled or fearful. Jesus gives a peace that is greater than our own hearts. Now, really, as we think about what Jesus is telling the disciples, the content of what Jesus is telling the disciples, really, Jesus is telling the disciples some things that could cause them to experience some fear. Jesus is telling them some things that could cause them some trouble in their hearts. After all, he's telling them the one that they've been following, their master, their leader, their rabbi, their friend, the one that they've given up everything for, he's telling them that he's leaving them. And so in many ways, their own hearts could tell them that this is cause for alarm. So when we were living up in Fort Worth, we had an alarm system on our house. It was an alarm that we would set before we would leave for work, and we would set it before we went to bed each night. Now, if you opened up the front door while the alarm was set, there would be a delay before the alarm would sound so that we would have time to go punch in our code. But if you open up the back door when the alarm was set, there was no delay. The alarm would just start sounding. So one Saturday morning, I am asleep in my bed all nice and snug. Sarah and the kids, they were up already, and they forgot to turn the alarm off before opening up the back door to let the dog out. And so I'm asleep in bed, and all of a sudden the alarm starts going off in our house. So I jump out of bed, jolted awake. I run, and I start punching in the code to turn the alarm off. I get the alarm turned off, but then the alarm company comes over the speaker, and they want our secret safe word, a word that I had never used before. And we had this alarm system for a few years at this point. I couldn't even remember the safe word that I had told them when it was installed. And so after a few attempts of trying to tell them our safe word, the alarm company finally gave up on me, and a few moments later, the police were at our door. And so instead of sleeping in that Saturday morning, I found myself standing at the door telling the police there was no cause for alarm. So here Jesus is. He's preparing the disciples for his departure. But not only that, he's really preparing the disciples for the events that they were about to see unfold. They were going to see him betrayed and arrested. They were going to see Jesus beaten and nailed to a cross. Certainly, this could produce trouble or fear in their hearts. And so what Jesus is telling them is, your hearts don't have to be alarmed. When you see all of these things happening, when you feel that trouble or fear rising up inside of your hearts, don't be alarmed. You can experience peace. Your hearts don't have to be alarmed. So there's a lot of chaos in our world today. Would you agree? Sin is rampant in our culture. The economy is difficult in our country. There are wars and rumors of wars on other continents. And so we can look at all of these things going on around us, and our hearts could easily be troubled. Our hearts could easily experience fear. And so I want you to hear me today. If you are a believer, if you are a Christ follower, your hearts don't have to be alarmed. Rather, even in the midst of all of this chaos, your heart can still be at peace. And instead of being a thermometer that reacts to all of the circumstances around us, the peace that God offers us, the peace that Jesus offers us, is like a thermostat that regulates our hearts in the midst of any circumstance. So don't let your heart be troubled or fearful. Your hearts don't have to be alarmed. So Jesus gives a peace that's greater than our own heart. Second, Jesus gives a peace that is greater than the enemy. Let's look at verse 30 again. It says, I will not talk with you much longer because the ruler of the world is coming. He has no power over me. Jesus gives a peace that's greater than the enemy. So when Jesus says the ruler of the world is coming, he is referring to Satan. If you remember back in John 13:27, Satan entered Judas Iscariot before Judas got up to go and betray Jesus. And so as Jesus is talking to the disciples, Jesus is very aware that Judas and Satan, they are on their way back. Now, when Jesus calls Satan the ruler of the world, this is not to imply that he has the ultimate authority over this world. It's not to imply that he's the ruler of all things. While Satan does have some power, his power is in no way equal to the power of God the Father or Jesus the Son. Rather, any power that Satan has is simply a power that God has afforded to him, that God has allowed him to have for a time so that God himself might ultimately display his glory through the sacrifice of his Son and through the salvation of many. But where there is strife in this world, where there is rebellion in this world, where there is hatred in this world, where there is confusion in this world, really where there is sin in this world, ultimately it is a result of the influence of Satan, whether directly or indirectly. Bottom line, Satan is the god, little g, of the sinful hearts of mankind. But Jesus gives this reminder that he is greater than the enemy. And this would be important for the disciples to hear. Because certainly as Jesus is arrested, beaten, and crucified, it would be very easy to see those things and think the enemy is winning. But what the disciples couldn't see at that time was that ultimately all of this was for the victory of Jesus. Satan did not win. Jesus won. And Jesus will always win because Jesus is greater. And so I want you to hear me this morning. Because Jesus is greater, we have a peace that is greater. Because Jesus is greater, we have a peace that is greater. Listen, as we turn on the news, as we look at social media, as we look at the world around us, we could look at all of these things and say, man, things look dark. It may look to us like the enemy is winning. And all of that can easily stir us up. So I want to remind you that Jesus is greater. And if you don't remember the end of the story, the enemy, Satan, does not win. Jesus wins. In fact, Jesus has already won because he defeated the grave. Jesus conquered the grave through the resurrection. And so Jesus has already won. And so this reminder that Jesus is the victor, that Jesus wins and will always win, that he is greater, should give us a peace in the midst of the chaos that we're living in. Because Jesus is greater, we have a peace that is greater. So Jesus gives us a peace that's greater than our own hearts. He gives us a peace that's greater than the enemy. Finally, this morning, Jesus gives us a peace that is greater than our location. Let's look at the very end of verse 31 again. Jesus said, "Get up, let's leave this place." Jesus gives a peace that's greater than our location. So all of these words that Jesus has been speaking to the disciples up until this point, Jesus has been speaking to them at the table that they just shared that Last Supper with. Really, we could say that he was sharing all of these words in the safety of their small group, in the safety of the walls that they were in. But the peace that Jesus was offering to them wasn't simply for them to experience at the table. The peace that Jesus was offering to them was a peace for them to experience in the world wherever they might find themselves away from the table. So, if you remember Paul Michael Vaca, he was our guest speaker for our fall revival in the park. Back in 2013, when Paul Michael and I were on staff together, we traveled to Colorado to plan a mission trip to work with a church plant that year. And so our planning on the day of our departure, our planning ended early, but our flight wasn't until the evening time. And so Paul Michael had the idea to go snowboarding, something he had done many times before, something I had never done before. And so for those of you familiar with Colorado, we went up Arapahoe Basin and proceeded to snowboard down. Really, he proceeded to snowboard down. I proceeded to fall down and get back up over and over again. So long story short, as I'm coming down that trail, I hit a patch of ice with my snowboard, and I hit that patch of ice, and I fly up into the air, and I slam down on my backside hard. My entire backside was bruised. One giant bruise, biggest bruise I've ever seen in my life, just all black. So when we got on the plane that evening and started flying, we began flying through a terrible storm, and we had the worst turbulence. So that plane was jerking up and down all around, and I was being bounced up and down in my seat. And of course, I had that giant bruise on my backside. And so every time that plane jerked around and I bounced up and down, all those on the plane had the joy of hearing me go, "Ouch!" Yelp. That turbulence was not fun. You know, it's easy to have peace when we're with other believers. It's easy to have peace when we're at the table of the Lord, when we're within the walls of our church or within the walls of our own home. But when we go out into this world, sometimes it feels like we are being jerked around or bounced up and down. Sometimes it feels like we are going into turbulent places. So I want to give you this reminder this morning that the peace that Jesus gives isn't just for the table. The peace Jesus gives is for the turbulence as well. And maybe you need that reminder this morning. The peace Jesus gives isn't just for the table. The peace Jesus gives is for the turbulence as well. The disciples, they were about to experience some turbulence. As they left that table, as they went out to a new location, the location where Jesus would be arrested, and then the location where Jesus would be crucified. But even though they would go to these new locations where they would experience turbulence, Jesus reminded them that he was giving them a peace that they could take with them wherever they might go. And if you're here today, and if you are a Christ follower today, I want you to know you have a peace that you can take with you wherever you might go. It is a greater peace, greater than our own hearts, greater than the enemy, and greater than our location. And this peace that we have, it is a gift, and it is a gift that we have been given because God was faithful to to provide Jesus to us all those years ago. And so my encouragement is that as we continue to go through this Advent season, is that we would be intentional to remember God's faithfulness as we walk in this gift of peace. Now, if you're here today and you would say that you don't have this gift of peace because you have never surrendered to Jesus Christ as the Lord of your life, then I want to give you the opportunity to receive that peace this morning. And so in just a moment, we're going to sing another song. And as we sing this song, this is going to be your opportunity to respond this morning. And if you're here today and you would say, you know what? Truth be told, I have never allowed Jesus to be the Lord of my life. Maybe you've been attending church for years, but you would say, I've never submitted to Jesus Christ as Lord, but today I'm ready. I'm ready to turn from my sins. I'm ready to allow Jesus to take authority, to take control of my life, that I might have this greater peace. It's a peace that even satisfies the turmoil of our own sin. And maybe you need that peace today. Maybe you're here and you would say, I've given my life to Christ, but I've never taken that next step of baptism like Blake did this morning. If you've given your life to Christ, listen, this is something that God calls every single believer to do, to publicly profess our faith in Christ through baptism. And may we all have the same heart that Blake had. I don't want to wait another day. Let me do it right now. If you need to make that commitment for baptism this morning, I would invite you to respond as well. I'd love to talk with you and pray with you. Now, maybe you've given your life to Christ. You've been baptized by immersion already. You say, I've been visiting First Baptist Church Stockdale. I know that God's calling me to make this my church home, to become a member of this church body, to connect my life with this body of believers, to be on mission with this body of believers. If that's you, then I would invite you to respond as well. Whatever it is that God's calling you to do, my encouragement to you is to respond to His Spirit obediently. Would you stand with me right now? Let's go to the Lord in prayer together.